Good morning and welcome back as we begin our second session. To chair this session, I would like to invite Dr. Paul Maglio. Dr. Maglio is the Senior Manager of Services Systems Research at IBM's Almaden Research Center. His group encompasses social, cognitive, computer, and business sciences and works very closely with IBM's global services. He holds many patents, has published more than 60 scientific papers in various areas of computer science and cognitive science. He holds a bachelor's degree from MIT and a PhD in cognitive science from UC San Diego. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Paul Maglio.
Thank you, Dharmendra. For the folks sitting in the back, there are seats in the middle. Just point that out, I feel compelled to. It is my great pleasure to introduce Joaguin Fuster. He is professor of psychiatry and biobehavioral sciences in the School of Medicine at the University of California, Los Angeles. He was born in Barcelona and holds an MD from the University of Barcelona and a PhD from the University of Granada. He has been on the faculty at UCLA since, I don't know when because he wouldn't tell me since when. He has also spent time at the Max Planck Institute and has been elected to the Spanish Royal Academy of Medicine. I really like saying Royal Academy of Medicine. He holds many other honors, some of which are listed in the biography that's in the packet. In his more than 50-year career, Professor Fuster has focused almost exclusively on cortical mechanisms of cognitive functions, and he has published more than 160 scientific papers, many of them in little journals like Science, Nature, Proceedings of the National Academy, things like that. For example, in 1971, he was the first to describe cells that do short-term memory. This is a paper in Science. These are cortical cells that show sustained and elevated discharge during short-term memorization, stuff that's later called working memory. In 1981, he and colleagues discovered the first visual memory cells in IT, also published in Science, 1981. In the 1990s, he and colleagues discovered and analyzed the properties of working memory cells for tactile features in somatosensory cortex. Professor Fuster has published 3 books. In 1980, The Prefrontal Cortex, which is now in its 3rd edition. In 1995, Memory in the Cerebral Cortex, and in 2003, Cortex and Mind. I believe he's going to tell us something about the data and theory contained in this last book today. I'd like to introduce Professor Joaguin Fuster.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Paul, for your kind introduction. At least I want to say that my books are overrated and overpriced. The one he mentioned about the 3rd edition of the frontal cortex, it's out of print. And recently, I looked for an old copy on eBay for a translation into Japanese, and I lost a bid on my own book, which is, of course, flattering, but very frustrating, too. One evening in London, around 1900, Charles Sherrington was gripped by the desire to find out what monkeys did when nobody was observing them. So he relates that I went very quietly down the corridor to the room where they stayed. I looked through the keyhole, and the only thing I could see was a little eye looking back at me. The situation is somewhat analogous to the one in which we are cognitive neuroscientists. looking through the keyhole of the microelectrode at the lower levels of sensory systems and trying to divine through it the structure of cognition, which means that my message today has got to be couched in humbleness, justified humility, and at the same time, however, hopefulness, hope and optimism. For thanks to the work of many people and to many microelectrode studies, we are beginning to understand the basic principles of some cognitive functions in the brain, notably working memory. It is my endeavor today to attempt to give you my understanding of some of those principles some 35 years after we found those memory cells in the prefrontal cortex of monkeys. Working memory is the active online retention of information for a prospective action to solve a problem or to reach a goal. That for prospective action, in italics, is really essential, is key. It is what distinguishes working memory from other forms of short-term memory, including the gateway to long-term memory. For a prospective action. That teleological feature is inescapable when we talk about the frontal lobe or we talk about working memory. Yes, teleology is taboo in science. It's suspect, yet here we are. It is essential to our argument when we talk about prefrontal cortex and working memory. The goal, the prospective action. That information in working memory is unique for present context and for the immediate future, but inseparable from past context. It is, in reality, long-term memory updated for prospective use. Therefore, working memory and long-term memory share most of the same cortical structure. And in order to understand working memory, we must understand some of the principles of the organization of long-term memory, which will be the beginning of my talk. A corollary to those things is that a sensory stimulus to be retained in working memory activates a cortical network that encodes not only that stimulus, but also its past associative context in long-term memory. In this talk, I'll first offer an overview of the structure of cortical memory networks, long-term memory networks, that is. Then I'll talk a bit about the cortical dynamics of working memory with emphasis on the perception-action cycle. There I will refer to two pieces of recent work, or relatively recent work, and data. This is, if you will, my security blanket. No scientist can be away from his data for long. Then I'll talk about some of the computational constraints, as I see, of my model. And I'll end up also with data, but this time from the human, summarizing in an animation the work of many people on working memory in the human. Let's start with a memory paradigm and network paradigm. Memory and knowledge are represented in widely distributed, interactive, and overlapping neuronal networks of the cerebral cortex, what I call cognates, units of knowledge, units of memory. Cognitive functions, all of them, perception, attention, memory, including working memory, language, and intelligence, are based on neural transactions within and between those cortical memory networks. So one first principle, memories or cognates consist of, not just simply represent this or that, consist of widely distributed networks made of neurons synaptically modulated by experience. Perceptual memory networks are mainly represented in posterior cortex, executive memory networks mainly in frontal cortex, and here's a key point. Networks intersect and interact and overlap profusely with one another. A neuron, practically anywhere in the cortex, can be part of many networks, thus many memories. This is a direct challenge, I realize, to any localizationist effort of memory. There is some topography to it. We'll go into it later, at some level, though. Finally, these interactions between posterior networks and anterior networks, bidirectional, are fundamental for the dynamics of memory, recall, memory acquisition, and, of course, working memory. In order to understand the formation of these networks, yes, we have to go back to the basic principles of Hebb, notably, as it's been said many times, cells that fire together, wire together. In particular, the second rule or principle, which states that when two stimuli arrive together at a certain location, will produce certain changes in postsynaptic neurons so that the transmission will be facilitated in the future through those membranes. We know that for that to occur in the cerebral cortex, we need certain limbic structures in their integrity. We need the hippocampus. We need the amygdala. By mechanisms that we do not quite fully understand, involving certain neurotransmitters and phenomena like long-term potentiation, connections are formed in the cerebral cortex, in the neocortex, this is archicortex, hippocampus, so that there will be those networks formed based on the operation of Hebbian principles. Now this is a myelogenetic map of the human brain, not a cytoarchitectonic map. The little numbers refer to the order in which the different areas of the cortex mature around birth and after birth. The lower numbers are in primary sensory and motor areas in dark. Progressively higher numbers are in areas in gray, and then the highest numbers in the white areas of upper association cortex. So there is a gradient of maturation epitomized by myelogenesis. We know that this is actually basically sound from our recent work on imaging, some of it done in our own house. Elizabeth Sowell Bartzokis. Here is roughly a gross scheme of the evolution of the prefrontal cortex, which grows enormously in the course of evolution and reaches as much as 1/3 of the totality of the human cortex, prefrontal cortex. So maturation progresses from primary areas to progressively higher association areas. Excuse the redundancy of the progress here, because I think it's essential to the dynamics of the system. Upstream connectivity also progresses from primary areas to progressively higher association areas. Thus, we have 3 structural gradients from primary to association cortex: evolution, maturation, and connectivity. Along those gradients, memory networks, cognates, become layered hierarchically from concrete sensory and motor memory at the bottom to abstract knowledge at the top. Every new memory that we acquire follows those gradients as it becomes associated with concurrent stimuli and, at higher levels, with pre-existent memories that have been evoked by current context. In this cartoon, we have a basic scheme of 11 neurons, or groups of neurons, connected together by the well-established principles of cortico-cortical connectivity. From primary sensory to upper association cortex, feed forward, feed back, convergence, divergence, and lateral connectivity. All these connections well substantiated by the work of an awful lot of people. So 2 stimuli come together through sensory channels, either the same modality or different modalities. And along those channels, they excite the activity of those respective channels of representation of A and B. Before I forget, very important, along with these upward connectivity, there are inputs from the critical structures of the limbic system that provide input about saliency, valence, and affect related to those stimuli. Very important for those connections to form at progressively higher levels. At some higher levels, there will be associations, or rather groups, networks, netlets, that really associate the 2 stimuli, and their context. So eventually what we have from that concurrent connectivity and association is a pattern of synaptic facilitation, which is there latent and which really constitutes the essence of long-term memory. So that eventually one of the stimuli, A in this case, will excite not only the networks of its channel, but the networks of channel B and many others that have been associated in the history of the organism with one another. This shows the scheme of progressive layering of memory types, long-term memory types, on the cortex of the human. In the posterior sector of the brain, of the cortex, we have primary sensory areas that are lit, activated first as memory is acquired. They themselves constitute a form of memory. It is the memory of the species acquired in the night of times, which is exquisitely adaptive. And it really is itself nothing but the structure of primary sensory systems as we come to the world with. Form of memory which I call phyletic memory. It's on top of that that progressively higher memories, categorically higher memories, and associatively higher memories are going to accrue. A step further into associative areas, we have polysensory memory. And a step higher, episodic memory. All of it within the general category of perceptual memory acquired through the senses. Higher yet, and more abstract, of course, semantic memory, the knowledge of facts, names, etc. And at the highest level, conceptual, perceptual memory. In the motor sector, in the action sector, we have a similar hierarchy from primary motor cortex up through premotor to prefrontal areas, forming there action memories, motor memories, structures of action. At the lowest level, phyletic memory, muscles, groups of muscles. Above, acts, programs, plans, and conceptual action memory. Note two things, at least, that these cones are inverted, diverge. So this situation is completely opposite to that postulated by the idea of the grandmother cell, you realize. The information is diverging and establishing more and more connections as we go up. The hierarchy that is being formed has nothing to do with a corporate hierarchy or a military hierarchy. See? On top, what prevails are massive networks that in themselves represent abstract knowledge, which has accrued from many, many instantiations of more concrete experience. The other thing I want to point out is that the connectivity is both vertical and horizontal. That there is vertical connectivity which is bidirectional in both hierarchies, which means that in their formation, the hierarchy or the structure is not going to be only hierarchically, but to some degree also heterarchical. It's a horrible word, but anarchical is even worse. Heterarchical, that is, different layers connected together. In an episodic memory, say, there are abstract elements in it, nested within it. So memories of different layers interconnect. This is important, not just only in structural terms, but in dynamic terms. And, of course, that connectivity through the longitudinal fasciculus between posterior and anterior cortex. Here again, this scheme is completely consistent with the concept that one cell or group of cells, practically anywhere in the cortex, can be part of many networks and thus many memories. What matters is the association, is the connectivity. This is what defines the code. At all hierarchical levels, executive and perceptual networks are associatively connected. Thus, executive memories contain perceptual elements or assemblies, and vice versa. You see, they are command cells in parietal cortex, and they are visual cells in prefrontal cortex. This executive perceptual connectivity becomes critical in the integrative dynamics of working memory. Essential to that dynamics of working memory, to ensure the orderly pursuit of a goal, is the mediation of cross-temporal contingencies between percepts and actions. Summarized by these two logical sentences. If now this, then later that. Or, if earlier that, then now this. I don't need to tell you that this really epitomizes the essence of delayed tasks, delayed response tasks, delayed matching tasks, which are the staple of any studies of working memory. Consider the sequence of acts on top. It's a sequence of stereotypical acts, thoroughly rehearsed, instinctual perhaps, where one act leads to the next in a sort of a chain-like sequence. There are really no cross-temporal contingencies of any essence here. Here, however, all acts are contingent on past events and or future events. This happens where we have a sequence which has to be formed of actions in the face of uncertainty, ambiguity, and where decision-making is important in the face of several plausible alternatives. Now, to understand how that perception cycle works between percepts and actions in order to mediate cross-temporal contingencies, it is helpful to look back into the basis of biology, to look back at the writings, for instance, of von Uexküll, who many years ago was a keen observer of animal species. He noted that in lower species, such as the anemone, all we saw there were reflex acts, reactions between sensors and effectors. Whereas in higher species, he noted, there is inside the brain some connectivity that goes from effectors to sensors, goes in reverse. This connectivity, he postulated, is what determines the control of the organism over itself, and its environment. So here we have the same cycle postulated by von Uexküll, 90 degrees turned, and with some of the Baroque language deleted or changed. We have here the prototype of the connectivity of the nervous system with this important feedback. This little arrow really encapsulates what we mean about such things as top-down cognitive control, monitoring, and, yes, working memory. Now, this scheme here, all of these arrows are thoroughly, empirically demonstrated by anatomical studies, especially in the non-human primate. The scheme of the perception-action cycle continues all the way down to the spinal cord, the anterior horns, the posterior horns. The scheme was adopted or brought into neurology by a prominent neurologist, von Weizsäcker, under the name of their Gestaltkreis, the circle of the Gestalt. Cognitive neurosciences, such as Neisser, and computational neurosciences, such as RB, adopted it too in their formulations. It is a fundamental principle of neural operation. So here we have the two hierarchies depicted before in the other schemes, the sensory hierarchy, the motor hierarchy. Changes that occur in the environment are analyzed through sensory systems all the way up to polysensory association areas, processed, then prefrontal cortex, premotor cortex, down primary motor cortex, the consequent actions. These induce changes in the environment, which then determine what's going to happen next in the sequence, and so on and so forth. And at all levels, there is reciprocal connectivity. See, when we have that chain-like sequence, where there are no cross-temporal contingencies, that can be integrated at lower levels of the cycle. We don't need the prefrontal cortex for those things. It's only when there is ambiguity, uncertainty, decision-making in the face of plausible alternatives. Then we need the integrative power of working memory at the highest levels between the sensory sector and the motor sector bidirectionally. These are some of the inner connections of the cycle at lower levels, of course. We have inputs from the hippocampus, the amygdala, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, they're part of the cycle at lower levels, only they're not as important as the cortical parts of the cycle for working memory. Here's the outputs from that cycle through basal ganglia, cerebellum, hypothalamus, thalamus itself again, and the pyramidal system. And here is a reminder that the basal ganglia are also part, with their loops, also part of that cycle. Not that they're not important in working memory, they are also, as demonstrated to it, for example, by the work of one of my former graduate students, Professor Gary Alexander at Emory. But the mediation of contingencies does not span the time spans that the higher levels, the prefrontal cortex, spans. Whereas the cycle operates in series and in parallel through the environment, important point, integrative working memory at the top of the cycle operates by reentrant cortical integration. So there is reentry at the top when working memory comes into play. Those arrows working both ways are essential for that reentry. So which means that, of course, vast expanses of cortex are involved in working memory. No wonder then that working memory cells have been found not just in frontal cortex, but in all those parts of posterior cortex which are connected to it in the perception action cycle. So memory cells have been seen in temporal cortex, in parietal cortex as well by many, many people. Now, just briefly, some examples of an example of cross-modal temporal integration in working memory. This is from experimental work that we have conducted in our lab. Here, the simple task is a monkey is presented with a sound which can be high-pitched or low-pitched. And by learning, by training, those sounds have been associated with colors. Kind of an artificial synesthesia, if you will, or induced synesthesia. So a low-pitched tone means that after a period of 10 seconds, the monkey will have to choose the green between two colors when they are presented. Whereas a high-pitched tone will determine a choice of red at the end of the working memory period. What this shows, simply, I can summarize it in a couple of words, is that there are indeed correlations between the response of cells to the tones and to the colors according to the task rule. All right? So cells will respond more to the high-pitched tone and to the red than to the low-pitched tone and to the green, or vice versa. In prefrontal cortex, that is. Further, we've seen cells that retain that capability to discriminate between memories during the memory period, when the stimulus is not there, either visual or auditory. So these cells bridge that time, integrate across modalities and across time, as we do in language and many other circumstances. Here's a brief example to make a specific point regarding variability of a cell in primary somatosensory cortex that is involved in working memory for a haptic stimulus, for a percept induced by the palpation of an object which has certain surface features, like vertical stripes versus another that has horizontal stripes or gratings. The monkey touches the object which he cannot see in the dark, retains that surface feature over a period of memory, and then, offered with two objects, a few seconds later, must choose the one that was. Delayed matching to sample with haptic stimulus. All right? In this situation, we find cells such as this one. This cell, this is time. This is the nature of the surface, horizontal versus vertical stripes. This cell obviously prefers the vertical stripes when it is presented at this time. And notice that that differentiation, that delta between the two stimuli prevails during the memory period, albeit at a relatively low level of activity. It is there. Low frequency changes or small frequency changes, but sparsely distributed. The point I want to make is notice the variability of the cell's response or the cell's activity during the memory period across the different trials. Sure, the averages very clearly show the differentiation, both during the queue and during the memory period, and at the choice. This is the receptive field of the cell, by the way. But with enormous variability in the period of memory. Something we'll have to contend with in any modeling of these situations. Another example of our recent work is that has to do with neurovascular coupling in working memory. This, you will recognize, is a very important issue because neurovascular coupling is at the root of all functional imaging methods, and it's still largely a mystery. So what we're doing is combining near-infrared spectroscopy, which has a poor spatial resolution but very good temporal resolution, with surface field potentials, with local field potentials, and with unit discharge in monkeys trained to do these working memory tasks. We co-registered these signals in an attempt to describe at different scales, at different levels, the translation of neural activity to vascular change. For instance, monkeys are trained in these two tasks. One is a delayed matching to sample task for color. The other one is a spatial delayed response. One is non-spatial memory. The other one is spatial memory. In these areas, the frontal cortex and parietal, will show phenomena such as this. In parietal cortex, for instance, we have here in red the level of oxyhemoglobin, the concentration of oxyhemoglobin during a spatial delayed response task. Here's in the same monkey, in brown, oxyhemoglobin in the non-spatial task. Notice that here at the Q, the responses of the two levels of hemoglobin concentration already change. Then they bump together here up. Then there is a diversion here. This is a spatial task in parietal cortex. Notice. Oxygenation goes down in the non-spatial task, up in the spatial task. What happens here at the time of the response is obviously confounded and perhaps compounded by the motor reaction of the animal. We've been able to get at cytochrome C oxidase, which is a critical element in the metabolic cycle here. So we're getting close to the metabolic response of the cells and also close to the oxygenation expression of that response. Now, as a result of our studies with microelectrodes and with cooling and with other measures and interactions between areas, we come to this general conclusion, here graphically presented, of the perception-action cycle in the different types of working memory. When the information that the monkey is retaining is visual, you get activation of both this part of prefrontal cortex and infratemporal cortex. When the information in memory is auditory, you get superior temporal gyrus and prefrontal cortex, bidirectional activation. Re-entry. When you get the information which is tactile, then you get it between anterior parietal and prefrontal. When the information is spatial, you get it during the memory period between prefrontal and posterior parietal. Now, the specialized working memory modules that have been found in prefrontal cortex are, in my view, nodes of heavy association in active executive memory networks. Those nodes encode specific sensory motor associations within widely distributed cortical networks. Networks that encode, again, the broad behavioral context in which those specific associations were formed and remain embedded. Now, here are some of the constraints, as I see them, a list of some of the constraints, as I see them, for any modeling of the cognate, of the memory network, both in structural terms and in dynamic terms. In structural terms, in terms of architecture, by definition, they need to have a network structure. An important point is that we're dealing with a relational code. Things are defined. Memories are defined by association, by relationships at all levels. Second, the model must be hierarchical and heterarchical for the reasons I have presented before. The model has got to incorporate plasticity, the capability of updating and changing those networks. On the dynamic side, the memory must be content addressable. Addressable by content, by association. It's got to be stochastic. It's got to deal with the issue of variability. It's got to accommodate variability. It's got to postulate, incorporate re-entry in it. Essential. The dynamics has got to be hierarchical and heterarchical. The processing has got to be in parallel, obviously, in things like perception. We process an awful lot of information in parallel, whether conscious or not. It's got to be also have an element of serial processing, especially when we're dealing with conscious attention working memory. Conscious material, conscious memories, or working memory, or attention. After all, working memory can be construed properly as a form of attention to an internalized cue. Finally, the model must accommodate category. It's got to be categorical. It's got to accommodate principles like that of degeneracy, both in perception and in action, to understand things like perceptual constancy. A rose is a rose is a rose, no matter what its color or smell. It's got to categorize. The same output from different inputs. And the same thing in the realm of action. There are many ways to get the same action done with many different inputs. So our model must accommodate that feature too. I'll end up with a couple of movie clips prepared in our institutions on working memory in the human. Now, let me tell you how we did this. It is a graphical meta-analysis, if you understand what I mean, based on the work of many people, many studies. Here are just 12 examples of imaging studies that we studied. Doesn't even include ours. We did some study with Barbara Schwartz and Holgren at UCLA, working memory with PET. Now, some of these studies are meta-analysis themselves, the ones marked with an asterisk. Now, where we needed information about the temporal course of activation in the course of working memory, we availed ourselves of our experience and the experience of others from works single units in the primate. Now, to be sure, there is a lot of generalization. There is interpolation, extrapolation, and yes, a degree of license in what you're going to see. But I believe it really represents the common denominators, or the most common denominators, of an awful lot of studies from the human and the non-human primate in working memory. Let's first look at the visual memory task. Visual delayed matching to sample. A face is presented. The subject remembers that face for a period of some 20 seconds. And then two faces are presented side by side. The subject must choose the one that was. Visual working memory for faces. The relevant areas. Fusiform gyrus, we're dealing with faces. In gray are the areas in the middle of the hemisphere. Anterior cingulate, superior, inferior parietal, motor area, etc., etc. And of course, visual cortex. This is real time as the marker moves along the line. The face is going to appear here, visual cortex, infratemporal cortex, fusiform gyrus, prefrontal cortex, mostly ventral, anterior cingulate, the perception action cycle working between these two great big sectors, progression toward the end, here the two faces, visual, and orbit of frontal cortex, reward and control of errors. Here's a spatial task, similar to the visual working memory tasks that have been used in primates, as a matter of fact. The subject is shown the position, this is the fixation point, the subject is shown the position of an object, say a star, on a screen. Must retain that position in mind, in working memory, and then effect a movement of the eyes toward that position, indicating where that star was at the beginning of the trial. First, you'll see the star coming up here, visual cortex, inferior parietal, dorsal, prefrontal, anterior cingulate, progression toward the back, toward the action, down the motor hierarchy, interconnectivity, perception action cycle. Here, the arrow moving to that position, and of course, again, anterior cingulate and orbitofrontal cortex. Here, it's a verbal visual memory task, or rather auditory memory task. The subject hears a word, must remember that word, and then must identify whether or not that word is in the list that appears on the screen at the end of the trial. Working memory for words. The word is pen. Superior temporal, auditory area, of course. 47. And dorsal prefrontal, part of the angular gyrus. And the words come on, orbitofrontal, anterior cingulate. Conclusions then. The memory code is a relational code. Memories are networks made of associations between more or less dispersed neuronal assemblies of the neocortex. The idiosyncrasy of our memories, really, when it comes down to it, is a direct product of the combinatorial power of some 10 to 30 billion cells in our cortex. Perceptual memory networks are organized hierarchically in posterior cortex, whereas executive memory networks in frontal cortex. Third, the prefrontal cortex at the top of the perception action cycle mediates cross-temporal contingencies with its integrative executive function of working memory. And finally, working memory is maintained by recurrent activity, re-entrant activity between prefrontal cortex and associative areas of posterior cortex. Here's a list of my collaborators in the two studies I've mentioned. Young-D Zhu, now at Johns Hopkins University, Mark Bodner, University of Pittsburgh, James Kroger, University of New Mexico, Alan Ardestani, a graduate student of mine, MD, PhD programs, Michael Gayou, another student now at Davis, and Arthur Toga, of course, one of the world's authorities in optical imaging. Thank you very much.
All right, we have time for a few questions.
Yes, sir.
What a delightful talk. I have a question about anterior cingulate. I recall that there's been a lot of thought, which I think you have some comments on, and maybe get an update of your opinion on the role that it plays in terms of sensing the state of task completion. In other words, is it in some sense a sensory area? And then the related question is, what are those very large cells in anterior cingulate doing? The large layer 5 cells.
Yes. I really do not know what the cells are doing, but indeed, that anterior cingulate region is, you could call it both sensory and motor. It is very important, it seems, for monitoring the results of an action. And it's probably no accident that it is at the interface between prefrontal cortex and limbic system, as you well know. Yes, Jerry.
Thank you very much. Does this work? It seems to me that there is a consequence of your memory formulation, and that is that memory is recategorical, never identical, and not coded in any specific mode. Would you not agree that with these reentrant networks and the combinatorial richness, you can deal with contextual variation, which is never exactly the same?
Exactly. That's why I shy away from the word representation the same way you do. Representation is unreal.
Sort of.
Because
Instead,
there's a
it's
constant
recategorical.
change. Yes, categorical, yes.
Okay, my question was regarding actually two. One is on forgetfulness. So when you talk about memory, is forgetting the dropping of connections or the reduction of energy? How do you explain forgetting? And also with respect to, at least in the case of recognition task, when there is changes, we can recognize an object even when it doesn't appear in the way that we actually saw it originally. So is that transformation also an underlying inherent representation in the memory, or is that something that is computed during recall?
Very good questions. With a lot of mystery in the answers, however. Because forgetting can be the product of very many different possible influences or causes. For one thing, forgetting, say, as a function of age or trauma or disease, may be the result indeed of the weakening of association or the dropout of synapses or neurons. But then again, forgetting, we know from the work, especially work with animals, can be the result of inhibition, of active suppression, and, Dr. Freud would like to say, repression of memories. We do not know the reasons why we make certain decisions. We do not know completely. Presumably, there is a lot of competition between inputs to the prefrontal cortex that claim attention, that require attention. We are not aware of most of these influences. And if we're asked, we can say, we forgot why we did that. But, and to the extent that we are unaware, we feel free. Nonetheless, the output is in itself a probabilistic result of the unconscious analysis of predictions and possible outcomes of which we're not aware.
I wanted to ask about here.
Yes.
I wanted to ask about timing. So we saw in this movie a very interesting flow of information, flow of activations of neurons between different areas. And there was something that seems to be, from an observant point of view, about inherent timing, that there seemed to be some time that it needs to be here and then some time that required before it can go to the next area. What happens if you request answer from the subject before this end? Will it start the motor parts before they actually finish all the processing of the visual part? Or what happened, on the other hand, when you request answer from the patient, from the client, whatever it's called, after all this process of perception has done? So what happens if you change the...
Timing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very good question. And it's applicable both to the primate work and to the human work. Much of the timing of the events that you saw in these studies is determined by the preconditions on which the experiment had been conducted, the set of instructions, and the test trials before the real tests. So that both human subjects and also non-human subjects in certain experimental settings can estimate the time of certain events that will happen. So can predict the time. In fact, that is the reason why we do find cells that will anticipate an event, a response, with a certain ramp up of activity predictably on every trial if the trials are administered in a regular fashion with always the same interval or timing or memory period. Human subjects do the same. When we change that, then the responses become either aborted or washed out, or you don't see them as clearly. You may see them, but without these temporal nuances that I have induced in here, in part, out of both the human work and the animal work, making some assumptions about the order of the process, and not so much about the timing, the precise timing of it.
One last question in the back.
Yes, sir.
So, thank you. That was an amazing lecture. If we go away from the classical view of working memory, and just for a moment hypothetically consider that perception itself, we learn to perceive the world, which in some sense, perception means that it's memory in action. We're using memory to perceive. So there, almost everything in perception is some form of working memory. So I just wondered, could you comment on the importance of memory in the background perception? Because if you look at all the examples you show, you have examples of the brain being active when there's a specific task, but I just wondered where is the rest of the perception, because the person or the animal doesn't go blind to the rest of the world when he's performing a working memory task.
Right. Well, this was really one of my points, that perception is very much informed by memory. We've known ever since Helmholtz, I guess, that indeed all the way we perceive the world is a projection of our memories. This is the way we categorize the world, on the basis of what we have in memory. And perception is nothing but categorization of the world, as Hayek said a long time ago, and others. So there is really no perception without memory. Now, arguably, however, the memory that is elicited by perception need not be working memory per se. It may be part of the process of acquisition of long-term memory, where new memories are incorporated to old memories, and old memories are updated, all right? The new over the old. That, yes, but it may not be memory that needs to be retained for an action or for a decision in the prospective future. You understand? Meaning that working memory per se needs perception for its evocation, to be sure, but it also needs this prospective aspect of the consequent action, this marrying of the past with the future, this integration in time that really is what defines working memory.
Thank you very much. So it's on to lunch now. Same drill as yesterday. Be back here about 12:30. Thank you.